Our next session is probably one of the most anticipated sessions of the entire conference, our ESG All-Star panel. We are in for a real treat here, I'll tell you that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, welcome. Welcome to our All-Star panel. It's interesting, what we've been going through, and maybe what I'll start off with is just a few comments about some of the things that we heard yesterday. Today we're hearing a lot about ESG. Peter just talked about the whole focus on procurement with a purpose. Yesterday in Jim's opening remarks to the conference, he highlighted the acceleration that has occurred over the last couple of years, not only in terms of the digital transformation that organizations are going through, but ESG. One of the things that we do as an organization, we focus on looking at some of these areas and studying them. One of the areas that we've studied for quite some time is diversity. And I always make a comment that the change that is occurring drives how often you actually, and the frequency by which you study something. If there's no change, it's like watching paint peel. Why study it? And one of the things, if you go all the way back to 2005 and some of the work that we did and just in the whole area of supply-based diversification, we started studying that, and over time we started going to a frequency of every 2 to 3 years in this particular space. Why? Because there was a lack of change. That fundamentally changed in 2020. The other thing that has been happening is not just the acceleration of what's occurring, but also the elevation. We've seen the elevation of these areas, supply risk, and certainly ESG, to not only the executive committees within our organizations, but also externally to our boards and other governing bodies of our organizations. So today, we want to share with you and share some insights from this panel here around the whole area of ESG. And I say the we. The reason I say the we is because, I'm going to be extracting and moderating this panel today and extracting some insights from my esteemed panelists here next to me. But at the same time, I'm going to give you all the opportunity towards the end to ask some questions as well. So let's get on with the introductions. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and we'll start over here with Sarah, just to introduce yourself and just a real snippet in terms of how you participate in ESG today at Harvard.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here and talk about such an important topic. You can hear from my voice that I was one of the people that Dawn spoke about earlier that might have had a good time last night, so I apologize. But, yeah, the two of us camaraderies. But as Chief Procurement Officer at Harvard University, it's a great place to be in terms of having impact with ESG initiatives, because really being part of a mission-driven organization is very empowering, and also being part of a campus that's a living lab. So we set by example, and we have the opportunity to ingrain certain behavior early on into our students who are going to grow up and go on to be leaders in the world that can have more impact in the space. So it's really a powerful place to be, to make change.
Yeah. Stephanie?
Well, if you were not at the session yesterday, I'm Stephanie Lapierre, founder and CEO of Tealbook. We are a supplier data platform. We are a data company. We've been investing in finding information about suppliers and digitizing the information to a profile that could be connected to our customers' workflow processes, systems. And one of the areas that our customers have pushed us about 4 years ago now is looking at the way that they were collecting information from their suppliers. Very manual. They had to get the financial data, cleansed before they could even reconcile the data. They had to validate certificates manually and then package it to report, which took about 6 to 8 weeks on average, and was, also missing suppliers that did not come to the portal. We didn't really know at the time, what that impact was going to be, but we decided, hey, let's look at, where there's data sets, let's use our machines to go and find this information. And we came back 2 weeks later where we automated their reporting by 75%, and we had asked them, what would be a win? How many suppliers that qualify, that are in your vendor master, that you think we could find, that we could celebrate? Because finding sort of, what's that first win? And they said 50 to 100. And so we came back 2 weeks later, we found 800. 800 qualified, certified suppliers that had not come to their portal to put their information. We also found another 800 that were potential. So our machines found indicators that these companies could potentially qualify. We just couldn't find a certificate. Either we couldn't find it because we didn't have the data source, or they were expired, or they just had no certificates. And that represented $300 million in additional spend. And so having data is so powerful, and we've been partnering with customers like Harvard to make sure that they know their baseline and they have now the data that they need to drive their strategy and know how they can make a much bigger impact.
Yeah, it's a lot of that visibility. So we're now going to go to the side of the panelists that did not spend all night at Tootsie's.
You would not want to see me if I had spent all night there, no. Hi, I'm Jamie Crump. I'm president of the Richwell Group. I spent most of my career in procurement and did it for a lot of different industries. In 2017, I went out on my own. I had been doing both procurement and supplier diversity for some time on the corporate side. So I wanted to help companies get their programs off the ground. I also work with small and diverse-owned businesses to help them leverage their status, certified or not, and wrote a book called Backstage Pass, pulling the curtain back on supplier diversity. So our approach is that we look at it as a business strategy. In addition to all of the other great things, there's really firm business reasons why you really need to do this. And now ESG has come as well. I'm doing a lot of work in Europe and the UK and Canada, which is ahead of the US when it comes to ESG. And so have been, spent some of the downtime getting smarter about that and helping clients integrate that into their 3- and 5-year programs.
Thank you. Amy.
Thanks. Amy Fong. I am with Everest Group. And for those of you not familiar with Everest Group, we're an analyst firm. We cover global services markets. So if you think about things like IT, services, some technology, business process outsourcing, as well as global locations, in-house centers, GBS, shared service locations. So our approach to ESG is a little bit different than some of this more different, sustainability that the others on the panel do. We are focused on, at the first step is kind of covering the service providers that deliver ESG services. So you want to hire a sustainability provider, or you want to green your IT, which is probably not the first place people look, but there's a huge amount of sustainability opportunity in your IT stack. Those are the kinds of providers we cover. We also, because we're looking at a lot of third-party services that are purchased by procurement, we look a bit more at the diversity in the workforce of those service providers. One area we cover that I think is probably underknown within the sourcing community is the concept of impact sourcing. The name is a little bit confusing, but essentially it's not a new concept, but essentially the idea of hiring service providers that are tapping on underrepresented communities. So that could be spouses of the military, it could be incarcerated women, it could be rural towns that have are economically need support, and service providers that might put a call center there or a IT delivery center there and helping to bring up those populations. They're not necessarily diverse certified businesses, but they are certainly creating a big impact on society, and that's a trend that's been growing and growing. From in the U.S. as well as globally in different countries. We actually just last week, I think we're on the with the Clinton Global Initiative pledging to grow to 500,000 jobs in the impact sourcing space in the US in the next few years. So that's been a big initiative of us, as well as we look at some of these large, say IT services categories. Most people use third parties for a lot of their IT work these days, moving beyond, helping companies to move beyond just the top providers that, are not necessarily diverse, and bring in specialists that may have a diversity status or be tapping into that diverse workforce. So that's been a lot of my focus in the last few years, and it's probably not the first category people tackle when they start on diversity and sustainability, but it's still an important one, I think, in the long run.
Well, thank you. I think, as you can see, we certainly have a diverse perspective in terms of how all of the panelists are participating in this whole space of ESG. So what I'd like to do is begin with our first question, and I'm going to reflect back on some of the things that we did yesterday. Caitlin was out here yesterday from Gartner, and one of the things that she showed was the Gartner hype cycle. And I have my notepad because I can't always remember the stages, so I have to go through there. But one of the things she talked about was these 5 phases. There's an innovation trigger, a peak of inflated expectations, a trough of disillusionment, a slope of enlightenment, as well as the plateau of productivity. And she looked at 2 different technology solutions on there. One was the whole area around sustainability applications. And she had that, really in that phase of peak of inflated expectations. But she also highlighted the area around, supplier diversity solutions as well. And that was one that was just about ready to exit the peak of inflated expectations and move into this trough of disillusionment. Now, what I want to ask you all on my panel today is when you think about ESG in a broader context, not just the technology solutions, where do you see we are today in this hype cycle as you go through these different phases? Jamie, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think it's at the peak.
The peak of inflated expectations.
The peak of inflated expectations.
Okay.
And the inflated piece it's hard. I mean, we're finding that the data is difficult to get. It's hard because nobody has standardized yet on the data that's actually going to be needed and what everybody is going to report on. So I think right now you have a lot of people who are getting on board, and then they're finding out this is not easy. This is going to take a lot of work. It's going to take some data that we may not have today. So they're looking for those other sources. And nobody wants to be in the trough of disillusionment.
Disillusionment, yep.
I mean, how was your day, dear? I'm in the trough of disillusionment. Oh, leave mommy alone. She's going to take a bath. Yeah. But I think also there's a bright side to that, which is, you kind of give up. You go in with all these great expectations and all of this intention, and then you find that it's going to be harder than you thought it was. But the good news is that the technology is there and available. So we can work through that. So, the disillusionment is I thought it was going to be easier than it's really going to be. But it doesn't mean that it can't be done. And I think that the fact that you have countries and companies coming together who are going to be trying to solve this and have the technology available versus 10 years ago when we were trying to solve supplier diversity and the data just wasn't there. You were scraping it by hand and you would have killed or died for an Excel spreadsheet at that point. Now it's really here. And so, we're going to go into the trough at some point. But I think it's going to be a very short visit before it springs back up, because I think we're going to be able to figure it out.
Okay. Amy, not going into a lot of detail, what phase do you think we are? Do you agree with
I
Jamie?
agree with Jamie. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of aspirations around this, and it's not that the tech isn't there, it's that it's not as easy as we had hoped, right? But I do think that we're to the point where, where I look at where we are now versus 10, 15 years ago, it's much easier. The the tools are there, the data needs to reach that level, and then, that to support our goals.
We have a Stephanie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
With Stephanie. And we'll talk about goals, I'm sure, but I think the data is there to support more holistic goals as well as we start to build that out. So
Yeah.
I think we'll shift our thinking a bit as we hit the trough.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a reckoning time.
So we're 2 peaks of inflated expectations, Stephanie?
Yeah, we're definitely, I agree with this stage. I think when we look at our technology, we've done supplier diversity, we've now released sustainability certificate, but it's a forever, ever investment in finding more data sources to address all of the different requirements that you have to report on, depending on your sector, depending on your regulations, depending on your decision to how you're going to standardize or how it's going to be standardized for us. I was a judge at DPW, the Digital Procurement World Conference, and there was about 90 companies that addressed. Those were the selected out of thousands of companies that were included in that category. And the first company started pitching, and I asked, how do you get the data into your software? And then they say, oh, the suppliers are going to come and they're going to put their information. And you get to the second one, which is now another version of another part of ESG. So they ask, how does the data get in your software? And like, well, the suppliers are going to come to our marketplace because blah, blah. By the third, the other CPOs caught on. They're like, so how do you get the data in the software? And right away, you can see that to address all those requirements, you're going to need maybe 5 to 25 different software to address different things that are going to require suppliers to put information. How are you going to reconcile that? How are you going to ensure that it completes the information that you need to power your decision? It's going to be really, really hard if you don't have the data. So biased in my opinion, but you have to start data first and then choose a technology that fills the gap.
Okay, I want to come back to that point, but Sarah, real quick.
Yeah,
Pete,
so I think that I have to agree.
Okay.
I think that we've spent a lot of time harnessing passion around all of this to get to that peak.
Yeah.
Maintaining the momentum, that's where it becomes hard. And I think that that's where technology can help, so we get baselines and can measure where we are and the progress that we're making so people remain excited about it.
And I just want to add, because yesterday your team said something so powerful. The audience asked, do you set goals? I said, we can't set goals until we have the data, we have the tools that they can then do something about it versus just putting a number out there with no solutions or ways to drive change.
Yeah. And I want to bring up another model that was introduced yesterday. When Sean was out here, the professor, and he was talking about this whole phase. He called it the orders. The first order was digital transformation. And his comment was that we typically follow digital or digitization with datafication, okay? And so we go through these phases. One of the examples he used was music. We started off with all the technologies. I mean, I'm going to date myself, the Sony Walkmans, et cetera. And we digitized a lot of different types of technologies. And if you look at the music industry today, it's all about the data. So I want to ask you also, similar to where we are today, and Stephanie, I'm going to start with you since, talking about data, where are we? Are we in the data digitization phase of ESG for the supply chain, the data piece, datafication, or are we just actually getting started?
I think we're getting started.
Okay.
There's data in so many places, but if you don't have the technology to be able to get it, and it's if your solution is to collect this manually through suppliers or even through your employees, I mean, it's going to be a long road and a lot of time wasted because the data is going to keep changing. So I think we're in very early stages, and hopefully we get to datafication. We're definitely driving towards that ourselves for our customers, but we're an early company too, right? So.
All righty. So, peak of inflated expectations, potentially starting to go down that curve, headed to a trough of disillusionment, according to Gartner, where we are today. And now, from just getting started on this journey, from digitization into datafication. Do you agree with that?
I do. Yeah, I think that we've got a ways to go, but I think the technology is there to support it. And I think, it used to be you couldn't get data. Now you almost have too much. You get data and what do I do with it? So I think the big next step is going to be taking all of that data that I have and how do I use that in the smartest and most efficient manner possible. And the people who figure that out are going to be the leaders.
Okay. Amy.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's also, everyone in the audience knows if you're here implementing source to pay or some kind of procurement technology, there's a bit of a prioritization, and this is probably not the first thing you started with, right? When you chose your solutions, and for that reason, I think that the ESG space, whether you're looking at the diversity side or sustainability or any other aspect, is still probably in the early stages of digital transformation. I think because the technology is there though, we have the ability now or the opportunity to accelerate that. As you get your core platforms in place, use these tools, use the data that we now have to accelerate into that digitalization phase.
Okay.
It's not going to be the time frame from the record to Napster,
Yeah.
to data solve. But
I forgot about Napster.
That was 40 years.
Yeah.
This is like 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be quick.
I want to go because I think a lot of you are saying, hey, we're still trying to get our arms around the technology right now to support this space. But if you look at what we were talking a lot about yesterday and even some of today, there's been a lot of focus on things like artificial intelligence, autonomous procurement, et cetera. And as we think about these technologies, I want you to maybe share in terms of, as you think about AI and you think about some of these technologies, how will they be applied in ESG for the supply chain? Sarah?
I think AI is going to be huge. The reason that it's taking so long, it's very hard to make things actionable. As Peter was just saying on the stage, is that good intentions are great, but if you can't make them actionable and make progress on them, that's where the disillusionment and frustration really comes in. I think AI is going to make the information so much easier that you don't have to think about it. The harder it is for people to be able to do something and find what they need, they have too much on their plate. AI will make it so much easier to embed it and ingrain it into processes, and I think that's where we're going to see so much more traction and offset some of that disillusionment.
Okay. Jamie?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the AI, the machine learning, we've all worked with people where you were training and you're having to tell them the same. If you had to tell them the same thing to do every day when they came in, you'd be rethinking that hire at some point. But the beautiful thing about machine learning is it's going to get smarter as it goes. And so I think that's where the huge leap is going to occur, is because as this data gets collected, as it gets assembled, and we're doing smart things with it, then they learn that, right? The machine learning learns that and says, okay, well, if we're going to do this, then we can do this. And, obviously you're not going to plug it in and go home. There's going to be a lot of work to do, but I think it's going to be very quick in terms of taking us to that next level.
Okay. How about some specifics? Amy, just how is AI specifically going to be utilized in this ESG for supply chain space?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways. I think back to examples that I've seen in the last few years of when you think about even cleansing, the supplier master and enriching data. Jason had some great points earlier that your supplier information. It's first you've got to get it all in one place and cleansed, and then it's constantly changing. There are many tools out there that can help you go from that process. We used to talk to companies that took 6 months to a year to get that data together, and now it can be a couple days. Just your spend analysis, your supplier enrichment, all of that. The more you can shift your individual's time from that data management activity to actually making decisions with the data, the better off you'll be, right? That's a more rewarding job. It's more, it's a higher ROI, and I think we'll see the technology, supporting activities in that way, so that individuals feel that they can make a bigger impact faster, getting out of those weeds.
Yeah. Stephanie?
Well, we had a customer that started in a digital transformation with a large mining company, and he joined a committee, and they had spent 4 months using another technology, trying to do supplier relationship or supplier data management in their software, and they were trying to figure out their baseline for supplier diversity. And our customer who had worked with us before said, well, I can get that data in 2 weeks, realistically, depending, technically possible, sometimes a bit longer, but it's like, why would that sign? You'd see our entire vendor master, the baseline for all your diverse by classification with spend, and they're like, that's not real. I know it's real. So that's, the power of having visibility. It's not that long when you think. So there's two things about AI machine learning I think that we forget is you have a way to automate processes in a software. And those processes are going to get better and faster, and they're going to learn. The other way is, and what Tailbook have been focused on, is where do we find sources of data? How do you harmonize that data? How do you continuously enrich it and add more signal to understand if an actual attribute, a certificate is trusted, or there's too much conflicting information that you can't put a high trust level. And then how do you pull that information into the right entity so that we can match it to your master data and give it back to you in a way that you can consume, report on it, do analytics, feed it in your STP. Those are two different things. And if you think of AI machine learning, it's pretty native as a technology. It's not very old. Like we started Tailbook 6-7 years ago, and the people that came out of these programs out of UFT were very brand new to ML. It's changed so much, in the last 5 years. Like we've completely rebuilt our tech because, we've learned and the technology is accelerated at a pace that now we can do things that we can do, 5-6 years ago. Plus we have the capital. And 3 years ago, we used to do webinars on like what's machine learning and AI. We don't have to do that anymore. So I think the data literacy, the understanding of technology within procurement has advanced significantly in the last 2 to 3 years. But then how do you actually leverage it properly? And asking the right questions when you're meeting suppliers. And there's a lot of buzzwords, there's a lot of false promises. And I challenge you when you meet a provider to, what are the questions to ask, and really ask for metrics, because you may have smiles or you may have answers that are not quite. And I'm not talking about JAGGAER. I'm talking about, I was talking about with a company that does workflow, and they automate the workflow, but it still doesn't get the data in the software. And they were telling customers that they do. And I was like, well, how many suppliers come to your software? And then they smile and they're like, well, they gave me a big number. I'm like, how often do they come back to the software? Do you have the data, right? And do you have the metrics? And they smile. They're like, well, that's a bit of a challenge. Bingo. Then you know that it's actually not going to solve your data problem. So I think it's more the education, and we're trying to contribute to provide more literacy. But there's so much information now that you can get educated on. That's a good place to start. Yeah,
and it's interesting because you've all been talking about the data and the need for this, but I actually envision a future where we have, and if we have all of that data about our suppliers, we have the intelligence that we know. I go out to supplier A, B, and C. I understand where they are in all the different aspects of ESG from an environmental, social, and governance standpoint. And you could imagine our companies saying, these are our objectives as a corporation for our supply network around ESG. And the ability to architect a supply network that meets the objectives of the company. Because every company is going to have different objectives around ESG. Some may put more weighting on the social aspects of it. Some may put more weighting on the environmental aspects depending on the industry, et cetera. And as a result of that, you could imagine saying, these are objectives at the board level, executive level of the organization, and now how do we architect a supply network that meets that? Well, we have to have the intelligence about all the suppliers in the network, and then we can actually do the scenario modeling. That's where I see us actually flowing, not only with the data, but also with the artificial intelligence. So I want to, look at another thing, and we've been hearing a lot about this impending, recession. Jason highlighted that in his talk earlier today. There's debate. If you look at some of the countries in Europe, UK, already stating that yes, we are in a recession. People are over here are arguing whether or not we are or we aren't. But suffice to say, the majority of CEOs out there are expecting us to be in a recession, if not already in one. There was an article, and I sent it out to all the panelists I think it was on Tuesday this week in Bloomberg, where they interviewed a bunch of CEOs, and basically all of them agreeing that we're moving into a recessionary environment. And the question is, are we going to see a drawback in terms of what we're doing in our ESG efforts? And what it highlighted is that CEOs are sitting there saying, you know what? If we're going into some more difficult economic types of situations, choices are going to have to be made. And the article highlighted that they believe, and the survey that they did, is we're going to see a bit of a drawback in terms of our focus on this particular space. So I want to ask you all, what are your thoughts? Understanding that we have an uncertain future, there's a lot of uncertainty in a lot of different ways. We could have a soft landing, a deep recession, continued inflationary environment, et cetera. What is that impact on the efforts that we've made in supply chain ESG on a go-forward basis? Sarah?
So I think it's such a difficult question in terms of, unfortunately, I do think that there will be pullback because we're all fighting for funding. Whatever it is in our companies, we need more of something. And it's going to be hard to fight for those dollars, and people will make those decisions. But on the other hand, I also know that this is now more than ever when you really need to stay focused in these areas because the gap will widen so much. So the disadvantaged businesses, they will fall further behind if the investment and the focus and the opportunities aren't there. So, and whether it's sustainability, I worry more maybe about sustainability than diversity, that we're going to make steps backwards in terms of what we're doing to protect our climate. But in terms of people and well-being, I think we need to be able to maintain that focus on, align with your customers, your stakeholders, appeal to that passion that we felt over the past 12 months, the inequities that are out there, and keep the focus on that and don't let it fall back because it will take so much longer to get back to where we are today if we take our foot off the gas.
Don't disagree. How do we do that? How do we keep our companies, if we believe that, how do we keep the focus? Again, we're having to balance as organizations, in terms of the investments, keeping the financial viability of my organization going forward or making investments in here. Jamie.
I think that, there's a tendency whenever there's a recession to pull back. I mean, that's just natural, right? That's what they teach you at CEO school is, you have to reduce that spend. I think this one's a little bit different because this isn't, gee, we were going to do this as a company, and so now we don't have the funding and we're going to pull back. This is much more of a global aspiration now. And there are too many people who are already in favor of it, whether it's because they believe in the climate change, whether it's because they want to keep those customers happy. I think the other thing you're seeing is much more interaction by the end customers themselves. You have generations now that won't even go to work for a company that doesn't support these things. Mm-hmm. We're finding that in the talent issue that we're having. If you can't, and by the way, if they do join the company and find out it's lip service, they have no problem moving. Much more than my generation, which would kind of stick it out by and large. So they'll move on. I think that combination, there's going to be that initial tendency to pull back, but I think it's going to become more about, okay, maybe we don't have the funding we thought we did, so how do we do this smarter? Is going to be much more the conversation that I'm seeing. And there will be those who pull back, and then they're going to be galloping to try and catch up.
Yeah. And we saw that actually in our study. We haven't released it yet, but just from a supplier sustainability standpoint, one of the objectives, they said, well, why are you doing this? And there's a lot of different reasons why organizations do it. But we've always had this, focus, choice in there around staff retention. And the percentage of organizations that see as a key driver of staff retention is increased quite significantly compared to what we saw 2 years ago. Amy, what's your perspective?
So I completely agree with everything the last couple panelists said. I think that there is a imperative and a realization that these things are not, yes, our customers care, yes, our employees care, and that's incredibly important, especially in the talent environment we're in, but the purpose here is important for all of us, right? Anyone with kids wants them to have a planet, right? Anyone who understands the value of diversity wants their workforce and their suppliers to be tapping into people in all, of all types, of all populations, right? So I think that, I actually personally witnessed a few companies that, as we came out of COVID and financials were looking good. It was a little bit of a kid in a candy store. Like, I want to buy this $1 million project to do this, and well, that's great and all, and I respect the investment. It's probably not realistic and sustainable, and some of that has been scaled back. Not in the sense, though, that we're not going to do this. The message there was, this is still important, but we need to scale it down a little bit, right? We still need to buy vegetables. This is vegetables now. But maybe we're not going to get, the top line. We're going to find a little more economic, reasonable way to do it. That doesn't mean that we don't still need the data, the technology, and all of that. We just have to be a little more, streamlined and reasonable in how we roll all these things out. It may take a little bit longer if we have a deep recession, but I don't think we're going to come out of it and say these things don't matter. I think the ship has sailed, and the social barometer has shifted to the point that those who think these things don't matter are the minority instead of the majority now.
Okay. Final question. Then we're going to get some perspectives from all of you and some questions. We're all sitting here 5 years from now. Not 3 years, I figured 5 years. 2027. Now, I may be retired, but we're all, let's just envision that we're all sitting here. We're having a conversation on supply chain ESG. What are we talking about up here on stage? Stephanie, I'm going to start with you.
Not this conversation.
Okay.
I think, when I look back 5 years ago, I found an old slide from Eloise Epstein at an ISM, and she predicted 5 years, which is actually really cool that it's happened. So she went from software to data silo and stack to data lakes, which is happening now. A lot of companies are building their own data lakes. There's a lot of limitation with your own data lakes because you're assuming you've got good data right in the first place. And then moving to more interchangeable, and we hear a lot with JAGGER of like just the interoperability of the systems and the data. So I do think, if you're looking at checking a box on something like supplier diversity, it is commoditized. They are portal-based solution you can buy. If you're looking to use supplier diversity as a way to start on that foundation to have better data that's going to drive also more outcome, because everything you do in procurement requires good data, it's a great first use case, and that's how we start working with Harvard and other clients, because it shows you a path to, hey, a data-led approach will beat every time a portal-based approach, and then you can start calculating the ROI on many, many other things that are going to drive savings, are going to drive value for the organization. So to answer your question, in 5 years, I'm hoping we're not having this conversation. I'm hoping that the data itself feeds a lot of the initiatives and that there's accountability and we're seeing some real change happening. And it's not the doing, it's more the driving the impact versus the collection and the things that are more tactical today.
How we're using it in the
That's
business. Right. Is it how we're engaging our business with it.
That's right.
Sarah.
Yeah, I see that in 5 years' time, we're going to be talking about the success and the innovation that we're seeing because we're focused on more face time with our stakeholders. We're not doing all of this data mining and spending time on the things, trying to realize these benefits. We're now enjoying them. So we've got healthier environment, healthier talent pool that's working with us, innovative relationships with our suppliers that are helping us drive innovation that we didn't even have time to think about, and really extracting value from those vendor relationships that we never get to today. And I think that's where the real excitement's going to come.
Fantastic. Amy.
Yeah, I love the idea of really focusing on the innovation and the extracting value from relationships. I won't reiterate that. I also think that we will have, I would like to see us evolve our view on how we measure ESG and what's important. Our current definition of supplier diversity based on ownership is from the 50s, right? And I don't want to imply that that's not an important, having small businesses and minority-owned suppliers is certainly important, but it overlooks a lot of other things. So I think we need to broaden that lens. As we expand the external workforce and the partnerships, we should be looking at the equity and inclusion among that external workforce, just like we do internal workforce. And we need to find a way to do that where it's not greenwashing, it's legitimate efforts that are actually helping people, helping our talent and retaining the best practices there, or working with partners that are going to have best practices among their workforce as well. I think HR does that, internally, but procurement needs to do that with external workforce, whether it's contingent or service providers. So I'd like to see a broader discussion around that, and maybe we'll have figured out how to integrate those metrics in when we have data.
Fantastic. Jamie.
I think in 5 years, we're going to be sitting here talking about, wasn't it awesome when we finally got blockchain in, so it was all transparent and the bad actors couldn't be bad actors anymore without all of us knowing about it. Taking that data and moving it forward, and now we can concentrate on the things that can really help move everything further along than what we are now. But I think we're going to be tremendously far along by that time. And I think that transparency of who's doing what is going to be one of the biggest game changers that we're going to see, that's going to help us answer all of those questions. And then from that, you'll get the standardized measurements and what are we actually looking at. And we can actually then spend more time, less time trying to find the right supplier and more time having a partnership and leveraging their core competency and ours together to continue to move it ahead.
I would even add, how do you, to your point, I think, how do you push this to your supply base? Because if you figure out how to do it, you can automate for yourself. How do you drive this to your suppliers? Supplier diversity is a great example, again, with Tier 1. If it's hard for them to report, but if you show them that, hey, there's a much easier way, and you can then start reporting to us. We had a customer a couple of weeks ago said that 72% of their Tier 1 were reporting their own diverse spend to them, and I was like, drop the mic, what? And because they are enabling automation. So imagine the power of doing this across not just diversity, but all your ESG requirements, and then driving change. You're now impacting thousands of businesses, right? And so it's well beyond your own, efforts.
Yeah, and I think, as you all say, I think what you're envisioning is a future. 5 years ago, our conversation isn't about, how do we get the data, how do we get the technology, et cetera. We're talking about now, how do we use ESG to enable what we want to accomplish as an organization? And that's going to vary by companies.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a different conversation. So with that, I'm going to open up for some questions, and I'm trying to see if I can see hands out here, but does anyone have any questions for the panel here, things that you would like to ask on the whole topic of ESG, either here or in the future? Looks like we've covered every single thing that's on your... Oh, I see one way in the back. I can't see who it is. Hey, Chris. Oh, that's Jason. Yeah.
Maybe up there is running any pilots around blockchain and ESG or flags?
Stephanie.
Well, so it's a sour topic at Tailbook because to do what we do, you don't need it. And so I think there's a lot of promise, there's a lot of potential. I think blockchain is definitely part of our future. But some companies like IBM had launched a blockchain supplier record, but it still needed the supplier to interact with it. And I don't know where that initiative, I haven't heard of it in a while, and I think we talked about this way back, so it hasn't really caught on. And blockchain is very expensive. It's actually not good for ESG also as a technology. And so it's expensive, it's not a sustainable technology from an environment perspective. And there's some better now that are not taking as much energy, but it's a very expensive way to do what we're trying to do and get more visibility, transparency on records that, we're not talking about people's personal information. We're talking about business information, which is critical, but the suppliers want to do business with you. They want to give you their records. They want you to know that they're certified and they have, for ISO, SOC 2, all of that. So it's very different than personal information. So, we have a lot of debates, and a lot of customers are asking, are you doing blockchain? And I always sort of pause, smile, kind of, why do you think it's so important? But I think there's more education, and I'm 100% certain it will be part of our future. I just don't know yet how do we incorporate it in a way that it can scale, and that's fully leverage at its potential.
And I would agree that today is not the day, because there are some aspects to it. But I think that the 5-year question, I think we're going to figure all that out. And I think we're going to figure out how to do it sustainably. And it's going to be the ability to be there. I mean, you think about, when I started my career, you couldn't even get your own systems to talk to each other, right? Now, I'm way older than the Sony Walkman. I think I was buying 45s. But I think in 5 years, we're certainly going to have that figured out. And I think the other thing is, when blockchain first came out, it was kind of like this panacea. It was going to solve everybody's problems on everything. And that's not the case. It's a tool in the toolbox. But I think from the standpoint of transparency in your supply chain, and answering questions like, are you doing it without, with the wrong kind of labor? Are you doing it in areas where you shouldn't be doing it? I think it's going to solve that problem.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that this panel is, at least the folks that said here, we're probably according to Gartner hype cycle, in the trough of disillusionment when it comes to blockchain. But what that means is we have a brighter future. So we're at time, and I just want to thank all the panelists that we have up here, and I appreciate all of the insights that you shared as we talked about various discussions. One of the things that we joked about coming up here is that we could sit here probably for an hour and a half and still not complete all of this discussion. You saw I had my iPad up here, and there were several other questions I wanted to ask, but we don't have enough time. So what I want to do is, thank the panelists. At the same time, I want to thank you, and we'll see you in 5 years. Thank you.